everyone, and welcome to our third Autism Hope Summit. We have a real treat for you next. Oh, I can't wait for you to hear Dr. Darin Ingels, and we're going to be talking about why allergies make autism worse and how to overcome them. So welcome. Thank you for being here, Dr. Ingels.
Oh, thanks for having me, Kristen.
I'm so excited about this topic because I think it's one that's overlooked by so many, and yet we hear about it, but no one's really talking about it, it seems. Now, before we get started, would love to hear why you're so passionate about what you do. How did you even get into this crazy autism community?
Well, we only have an hour, right? You know, it's funny. My background is as an environmental medicine doctor, and in that work, you know, we do a lot of investigating into why people get chronic illness, looking at environmental factors. So we're looking at things that people are eating and chemicals people are exposed to, and it really became evident with this, you know, rapid increase in autism that, you know, we know it's just not a genetic epidemic. That doesn't exist. So it was so clear that there's a huge environmental impact that's probably a big, you know, cause of why we see so many children with autism now. So as I started looking into it myself and seeing, you know, how all these various environmental factors were impacting not just the children with autism, but their parents and their siblings, and it was, you know, just a group of chronic illnesses across the board that all had some element of environmental influence. So, you know, that was really kind of how I got started. And then it just so happens I was working with a colleague in New York City who called me one day and said, "Hey, I've got some tough cases. Would you mind if I send them your way?" And it ended up being, you know, 10 new cases a week. So very quickly, my environmental medicine practice became inundated with children with autism. So, but, you know, it was just so rewarding to see what an impact you can have on a child with autism, you know, when you really start controlling, you know, different aspects of their environment, like the kind of food that they're eating, like the kind of, you know, things you're using in the home and on their skin and in their hair. You know, all these little things that we don't think much of can really have a big impact on their health and certainly their immune health. So it didn't take very long to figure out that this is, you know, really a missing piece of the puzzle in helping these kids recover. And of course, it was really nice to have a hand in helping so many kids, you know, get their life back.
That's so beautiful and rewarding to know that there are doctors out there like you that said, you know, I see the need for help, and I'm going to step up and do something about it. So,
yeah, you know, I'm not one of a lot of the doctors I know that have a child on the spectrum. I don't, but it's, you know, really become kind of my life's work. And at this point, I've treated, you know, over 1,000 children with autism. And again, just seeing over and over how much, you know, we can positively change their outcome by just making these, I'll say, relatively easy changes in their diet and lifestyle. Again, it just has a tremendous impact on their health. And
well, I'm excited to talk about our topic today because often it's just so overlooked. So let's just dive right in. You know, can you explain, you know, what are allergies? You know, I've heard of their dangers, but, you know, I think as a kid, you think of allergies as like achoo and like, you know, histamine.
Right.
Or, you know, sometimes we think of food allergies, but it's, you know, I don't think a lot of people really understand them. And I think that they kind of put them to the side and think, oh, they're really not all that important, unless it was like a life-threatening allergy, clearly. But they don't really think of them in the type of way that I really feel like we should.
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of confusion around just the word allergy. You know, in this country, we have a very narrow definition of what allergy is. And allergy is really defined as that anaphylactic, life-threatening, serious reaction. So these are the hives, these are the difficulty breathing, the swelling of the face that happens after a child eats a peanut, for example. And that does happen. Fortunately, that is a somewhat rare problem with allergy. But if you go outside of this country and if you read European journals, you know, their definition of allergy goes much, much broader than that. And I think most of us that work in environmental medicine, we really define allergy as just any kind of immune reaction to a substance. So the anaphylactic kind of reactions that we typically think of being allergy are mediated by a molecule called IgE. It's an immunoglobulin or an antibody. And that's the one that we typically associate with that quick reacting allergy. But again, that's a relatively small percentage of people. But yet we know there's a whole bunch of other immune mechanisms involved that create allergy-like symptoms. So again, if we broaden our definition of what allergy is and include any kind of immune reaction, now we're talking about a whole host of different things. And, a great example is at some point you probably got a test for TB. You went in, they gave you a little shot in your arm, or back in the old days, they used to have a little 4-tine thing. They would just stick you in the skin, and they said, come back 2 days later. Why did you come back 2 days later? Well, you came back 2 days later because it was a delayed reaction. And the way that you would test for tuberculosis is you would have to wait 48 hours to see if your immune system reacted to this little protein that they put into your skin. Well, we now know that a lot of these reactions that kid on the spectrum experience are these delayed reactions. So I think in our minds, we think of allergy being something that happens within, seconds to minutes. And we really forget or don't even know that, some of these reactions could be days after the exposure. So if there's a day that your child's having a meltdown and their behavior is terrible and they're just not focusing, and I said, okay, write down everything they've eaten over the last 3 days. What is it? I mean, you and I would be very hard pressed to try and, identify what that potential trigger is. So because it's food and it's mold and it's pollen and it's chemicals, we kind of have to do our detective work to try and figure out what are all the individual allergens that actually trigger that reaction. But, I think the common story is that, you take your child to the allergist, they do skin prick testing or maybe blood testing, and they do a smattering of different allergens, and they come back and say, well, I don't really see any allergies. And you walk out the door thinking, my kid doesn't have any allergies. Mm-hmm. Well, all you've really proven is that they don't have anaphylactic reactions. It doesn't mean that they don't have delayed reactions. So these late delayed reactions, I would argue, are really the more common problem in kids on the spectrum, and the one part that most allergists really kind of tend to ignore.
And so let's talk a little bit about, allergies versus intolerances versus sensitivities, because I feel like, at least in the autism world, in the conferences I've been to, it seems as though there's still some confusion about these, those three categories, especially for families that are kind of new to a diet or new to the biomedical world. I think that they don't really understand those three groups. Can we kind of dive into that?
Yeah, sure. So again, a legitimate allergy is the reaction that happens usually within seconds to minutes of exposure. So that's the bee sting allergy, that's the peanut allergy, that's something that happens very quickly. That's true allergy, at least in this country. The term intolerance actually refers to an enzyme problem. So when you're lactose intolerant or gluten intolerant, that means that your gut lacks the enzymes to break down these specific proteins. So in the case of gluten intolerance, it's the protein in wheat. In the case of lactose intolerance, it's the sugar that's in milk. So in those cases, you get physical symptoms, but it's not really an immune reaction. It's a digestive issue where your gut just doesn't make enough of the right enzymes to break things down. And that incomplete digestion is what triggers the symptoms. And then the term sensitivity is what we kind of coined to talk more about these late and delayed reactions. So again, these are the non-IgE, non-intolerance reactions that probably involve some aspect of the immune system that are delayed. So again, this could be hours to days after the exposure. So, when we're throwing those terms around, again, often they collectively get called allergy, but from a medical standpoint, we really do differentiate them, and potentially, they may be treated a little bit differently.
And so let's talk about the testing, because I know that there's different testing that can show different levels of quote unquote where the intolerance or allergy is. And when I remember, I look at so many different tests, so I'm wrong on this, but I think it's like the 1 through 5 when I'm looking at, where my son is, one being that he's very, very sensitive to it, and it's like in a red zone and you don't want to get near it. And one is maybe, oh, okay, well, he might have some issues with it and maybe keep an eye out on it. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, and it's even more confusing than that.
Yeah, that's why I like the basic one. I don't know.
So if you're looking at IgE reactions, again, if you go to a conventional allergist, they'll typically either do skin prick testing, and nowadays they have a test called a multi-test where they basically do 8 tests at one time, and they just poke a little hole in the skin. It delivers a little bit of that antigen, whether it's a food or a pollen, and they look just to see if the skin gets red and inflamed, and that tells you you're allergic. Conversely, you can also do a blood test called a Wrasse test. And this is also looking at IgE antibodies, and you have to check off as the doctor, I want IgE to dust or IgE to ragweed or whatever the specific allergen is that you're interested in looking at. So that's sort of the conventional way of doing allergy testing. You can also do intradermal testing, which most allergists really don't do anymore because it's very labor intensive. but they actually use a needle. They put a little bit of allergen underneath the skin, and again, they look to see if it gets red and inflamed. But you have to do that one by one, and so for a lot of offices, it's just labor intensive, so they don't tend to do that as much. In the sort of the alternative world, there's other ways of measuring, allergic reactions or sensitivity reactions. So you can do other types of blood testing. There are tests, most popular for food is IgG testing. The IgG testing is kind of a good news, bad news. I think, when you look at some of the research on it, I think IgG testing becomes a good marker about leaky gut, because when you've got leaky gut, you'll tend to make more antibodies against the foods you eat. My frustration came when I was early in my practice. I would see, we would do the test and people would have a lot of IgG antibodies and they say, oh gosh, those are all the foods I eat. Okay, well, let's change your diet, redo the test. Well, now the second test would reflect the current diet. So some antibodies that weren't there before now were, and other ones weren't, and vice versa. So it really became kind of confusing about knowing what's actually bothering you versus just what are you eating. So that's sort of the pitfall of IgG testing, is it may just reflect what you're eating and not necessarily what's actually triggering a reaction. There are other types of testing that get to be a bit complex that I won't really go into, but there's something like ALCAT testing, where they're looking at basically cell responses to mostly foods in that case. Some doctors really like them and find value. I personally, again, have found them to be inconsistent from test to test. So I personally don't use them in my practice. The gold standard for food testing is an elimination diet, where you just eliminate a lot of common food allergens for 2 to 3 weeks, and then you add the foods back one at a time every 3 or 4 days, and you just look to see what kind of reaction it provokes. That's certainly the cheapest, easiest way to do it, but it does take some discipline to be able to, pull all these foods out of the diet, introduce them one at a time. Most of the kids on the spectrum are picky eaters anyway, and so any kind of dietary change is always challenging, but that is a really very, inexpensive, easy way to try and help pinpoint at least, the food part of things. For other environmental allergens, there are other, we'll say, more esoteric ways that different practitioners do it. Some do muscle testing, some do electrodermal screening. These methods are more of a bioenergetic way of trying to evaluate how the body reacts to different substances. And again, I think they have value, but there's really no one test that measures all reactions. So it's not uncommon that, you're doing multiple types of testing to cast a very wide net to capture all of the different immune reactions that you can have. And, for the intolerances, that has to be done usually through breath testing or stool testing, because now you're just trying to measure if your body's breaking down that food substance. So, that's not a blood test at all. So, when someone comes in and they've got a lot of different kind of reactions and you're not sure if it's food or mold or pollen, it's not uncommon that sometimes you're doing 2, 3, 4 different types of tests just to figure out what's going on with the immune system.
Now, why allergies and autism? Like, how do those two relate?
Well, I think the relationship is that, there's so much research coming out about the gut-brain connection, right? We call the gut really the second brain. So as the gut becomes inflamed, and 80% of your immune function comes from the gut. So when the gut's not happy, that can translate into various, neuropsychiatric problems. So I think a lot of, the behavior issues we see, the cognitive issues we see, the mood, the sleep, the language delays, to a certain degree, that can be tied into this level of inflammation that happens in the brain. And a lot of that is triggered by, things that happen in the gut. So this is most directly related to, of course, food responses. But, we know that even if you breathe in some mold spores, inevitably you're going to swallow some of that, and that can still activate your immune system in your gut as well. I don't know if you had Dr. Theo on your summit, but he's done so much research on, children with autism. And I think one of his interesting findings is that he found that a lot of children on the spectrum have a lot of mast cells in their brain. And mast cells are the cells in your body that typically line your nose and your throat and your gut. So when you have a legitimate allergic reaction, these are the cells that get activated. Well, what he found is that children on the spectrum have a lot of mast cells in the brain. So when they get allergic reactions, they don't necessarily get hay fever with a runny nose and sneezing. They get neurological symptoms. So you'll see, again, mood changes, sleep disturbances, cognitive impairment, all this, variety of neurocognitive problems. So as much as we control allergy, we're ultimately controlling inflammation. And I think, brain inflammation is such a huge part of autism. If we can get that under control, often we find that, they neurologically improve.
And what are some ways we can treat them? Because I know each child's so different, and I know they're so sensitive to so many different things. Is there a basic protocol, or is it kind of different sub-protocols?
Well, I think the most fundamental thing that anybody can do is you can use products that are called mast cell stabilizers. So what these products do is they actually keep the mast cells from releasing all of these granules that are inside the cell. So the way that mast cells work is they basically like a balloon that pops, and when it pops, all these things called granules inside, that's what contains histamine and all these other chemicals that trigger the allergic response. So what these products do is they stabilize the membrane and basically prevents the balloon from popping. And we've got a lot of different products out there that do it. In fact, Dr. Theo developed a product called Neuro Protect that's a combination of quercetin, rutin, and luteolin. And these are bioflavonoid compounds that are very effective at stabilizing mast cells. In fact, quercetin is probably the one natural substance that has the most research behind it for stabilizing mast cells. So it's good, again, for food reactions. It's good for environmental reactions. And again, it's inexpensive and you can find it anywhere. So, we've got some over-the-counter stuff like, quercetin and luteolin, and you can move up the line, and there are things that are even prescription. There's a product I like a lot called cromolyn sodium. Cromolyn sodium is what they call a semi-synthetic bioflavonoid. It was discovered out of a plant from India. A doctor was using it because he had terrible asthma, and he found that this plant really helped, but there's a component in it that's a bit of a problem. So they had to tweak that one molecule out to make this compound. But cromolyn sodium, again, has a lot of research, and they actually make a pre-mixed version of it called gastrocrom that's used for food allergies. There's a nasal one called nasal crom. There used to be one for asthma called Intal, but it was taken off the market here in the US. So this preparation's been used now for probably 40 plus years, very safely, very effectively, but it is a prescription. So it's something, your doctor would have to prescribe. And then there's another product that's been used in Europe for many years called ketotifen. And ketotifen is also a mast cell stabilizer, again, that you can have a pharmacy compound. So you've got quite a few of different options again, getting these mast cells under control. And then beyond that, we start getting into specific types of immunotherapy. So the advantage of immunotherapy is you can actually start modulating the immune system to be desensitized against whatever the allergen is. So the concept's a bit like allergy shots. If you go to the regular allergist and you've got an allergy to ragweed, you would come in every week and they would give you a shot of ragweed. And at the right concentration, instead of making you worse, it actually starts to make you better. So we can do the same kind of concept without injecting it. So we do a couple different forms of immunotherapy in our office. One's called sublingual immunotherapy. Sublingual just means under the tongue. So these are drops that get made up for the various allergens that people might be allergic to, and they just place these drops under their tongue every day. And then we have another therapy called LDA, or low dose allergy therapy, which is even easier. And people get a dose of their allergens every 2 weeks under the tongue as well. So there's a few different ways to do that, but the ultimate goal is the same, is that we're really trying to take that pressure off the immune system, desensitize the immune system so that you can get exposed to these various allergens and have no reaction at all.
So it sounds as though you're saying, to make sure I understand, they can have an intolerance, they can have an allergy, a sensitivity. Obviously not, we don't want a life-threatening one, but for the most part, you're saying majority don't have that. Which
right.
But you're saying we can actually be desensitized to those allergies and go on to be able to eat certain things and be part of certain atmospheres that we once were not able to. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And I've seen a lot of kids, who are, again, picky eaters to begin with. So, they eat 4 foods, 5 foods. Of course, they tend to be allergic or sensitive to all 5 foods. There's this irony out there that you tend to crave the foods you're sensitive or allergic to. Mm-hmm. And I don't really know why that happens. My best guess is it's a little bit kind of like drug addiction, that there's something when you eat those foods that the brain gets a positive response, and therefore you kind of crave it and want more of it. Because I find kids, when they're sort of addicted to 4 foods, once we break that addiction, now they start opening up their diet, they're willing to eat more things. And then when you get done, they really don't want those foods that they craved before over and over. So, when you just do food elimination, often we see a positive response because you're not eating the food that bothers you. But if you go back and start eating it with any regularity, often you'll see that, kids start to react again. So the advantage of doing immunotherapy is that you're trying to induce a permanent change in the immune system so that, again, you can go out there in the world and eat all these different foods and really not have any kind of reaction. The exception really is the anaphylactic reactions. We don't really do immunotherapy for that because there is a risk of triggering the reaction itself. So that's the cases where that therapy is probably not better suited. But we will do the LDA, the low dose allergy therapy, in those cases.
And now, what about detoxification? I'm obviously thinking when I think of detoxification, I also think of cleaning up the diet, but
right.
I'm a real believer in the diet, and and I'm excited that one day that some of these children may not have to be on such a restricted diet, because
right.
that's the end goal. I mean, nobody has a child and says, "Well, gosh, isn't the baby so cute? I hope one day that it can't eat gluten, or I hope you never get to eat dairy, and I hope you never, ever get to have a normal piece of cake, whatever it means." I don't think any of us, having children thought that way. And, because honestly, as a parent, I'm a parent with a child with autism, with lots of sensitivities to different foods. He also has celiac disease. And it's really, hard to go out in the world. It's much easier than it used to be. I have to say that. He's 16 now, and 14 years ago, oh my goodness. I mean, they didn't even know what gluten was. I would go into a restaurant and I'd say, "Oh, do you have anything that's gluten-free?" And they'd say, "Oh, the bread's gluten-free." And I'm like, "That doesn't look gluten-free." And they say, "Oh, they don't use gluten in it." And I'm like, "Well, they use wheat?" "Well, yeah, it's just wheat bread. They just don't use gluten in it." And I'm like, I would just start giggling, like, oh my goodness gracious. And now you can go to restaurants and they have like sections where it will say, gluten-free. And obviously we worry about cross-contamination, but, some of us can use enzymes to help with that. But, I feel like today we live in a world where it is a lot easier if you have food sensitivities, depending on where you live, clearly. Obviously, I'm in Southern California. It's much easier here, I feel. When I go other places, I still kind of get looks from time to time, like, "What are you talking about?" "Oh, right. You Californians," I get that often. "Must be nice living in California, having all that." Or they do this, "Oh, that's just in California." I don't actually know what this means, but I'm going to say all the time. And so what I love about what your, treatment is doing is it's kind of helping bring back that, for lack of a better term, normalcy of like what we had growing up for the most part. You never saw, at least I never did. I mean, I'm thinking about all the kids I grew up with, and I didn't know anybody that had allergies to peanut butter or to bread,
never.
To dairy. I mean, I think I might have known one girl that said, "If I ate too much ice cream, I get a little gassy." Like, that's all I can kind of remember. And I think that was like in high school. Like, I don't remember anybody talking about this. And now we see animals, like you have certain like people that have their dogs and their cats, like, "Oh, they're allergic to this, this, and this." It's like it's just like whoosh, mind blowing, because where did this all come from? Like, it seems like do you have any theories on that? Like, why are we seeing so much more today?
Well, consider what's changed over the last, we'll say even 4 decades, certainly in the food supply. Food's not the same now as it was when we were kids. Between foods that have been genetically modified, and we do a lot of other things, like we irradiate food to help kill off bacteria, which in theory is a great thing, but it also changes protein composition. Mm-hmm. So of course we know chemicals are just constantly used in the food supply, and I think there's been a lot of talk in the last certainly 4 or 5 years about Roundup and glyphosate. Mm-hmm. And Stephanie Seneff has presented some pretty compelling research. When she looked at the rate of autism and the rate of glyphosate use, the correlation was over 99%. And, we say in statistics, correlation doesn't prove causation, but boy, that's pretty damning evidence if you ask me. And, we know that, wheat farmers douse their crops in glyphosate before they harvest it because it's a drying agent and they get a higher yield out of their crops. And so, a lot of this stuff gets done to produce more food, which in the grand scheme of things, you could say that's a good thing. But what have we done to compromise the integrity of that food? Why is it we see so many more food issues in our country than they do in Europe, where, chemical processes are not used in the same way, GMO is not used in the same way. So it's kind of hard to argue that, the way we treat our food doesn't have an impact on our health, because we're, I think, a pretty good example relative to the rest of the Western world, that we have so many more health issues than they do. And I'm sure, food isn't the only part, but again, it kind of comes back to environmental exposure, and consider that the average American gets exposed to over 80,000 chemicals a year. I mean, it's a lot. And, your liver, your body has to process all that. And of course, as, we'll say culturally, Americans become more and more overweight and obese, these chemicals get stored in fat cells. So sort of the heavier we get, we have a greater capacity to hold on to these chemicals. And that ultimately starts affecting, our other enzyme systems and cells, and starts affecting our function. So, we've just seen such a mass change in the environment, and certainly the food supply. And I mean, there was a study that came out of California in the last, it was I think at the end of last year, where they looked at all the wines in California, including organic wine, and 100% of the wines had Roundup in it.
Oh my goodness, even organic.
Even the organic wine, because now that it's in the water basins that, are underneath, the water tables that run underneath the land, even if the farmer itself is doing everything organic and proper, that water that comes up from the root system from, deep in the earth, is contaminated. So
what can we do? You can't, it's almost as though you can't really claim, or you can claim you farmed it organically, but you can't. I almost feel like that seal needs to change and let people know that, hey, we did our best. It's really Mother Nature now is like the way that the world lives, because I mean, that's just really sad. And is there anything we can do about that?
Well, I think, eating organic as much as possible, it still helps. I mean, it may not be no chemical, but it's certainly lower chemical. So I think as much as we can reduce our load, I mean, unfortunately, it's the best we can do. And honestly, I'm at a point where I'm encouraging people, particularly if you live in an area like Southern California, start growing your own food. You're going to get better quality than anything you can get out there. And it's amazing, actually, how little effort it takes to grow a lot of food. I mean, I had a little garden here in Connecticut where, we don't have a long farming season. And I was amazed what we were able to pull out of the ground between lettuces and carrots and beets and tomatoes. And I mean, we had a good stock of food for more than half of the year with actually very little effort. So I think as much as people can get educated on, doing some home gardening, home farming, you can grow a lot of things in containers where you can really limit to that Roundup exposure to nothing. When you've got complete control over what's being used. So for what we've got now in the US, that's about the best we can do. Short of moving to Europe where the food standards are different, it kind of is what it is. I'm hoping that as more people, get geared towards organic foods, the market drives how, companies act. And if there's enough of demand that they put on there, I mean, consider that the largest, retailer of organic foods is Costco. It's not Whole Foods.
Really? I knew they were the largest buyer of wine. I won't tell you how come I know that, but I know.
No judgment.
I watched some documentary of the lady that got that job, and I was like, my gosh, she has the best job known to mankind. But I didn't know you were the largest.
Costco is the largest retailer of organic foods. And again, if you go even to like Target and Walmart now, you'll see that they're carrying organic food. So, the tide has changed a little bit, and you're getting more and more people asking for these kind of products. And even when I go out to restaurants now, I see more restaurants even offering, grass-fed, free-range meats. So again, I think the more that people start to use their purchasing power, that will start to change the way that farmers do business. That'll change the way that companies like Monsanto do business. We just have to, make our choices when we go to the grocery store and what we choose to buy.
Now let's talk a little bit about detoxification. Obviously everything we're kind of talking about all kind of comes together, but is it important to do some form of detoxification with these children due to their allergies?
Absolutely. And I think, we could, although every child with autism is uniquely different, I think the one red line that we see running through most kids is that they're just poor detoxifiers. I think that's probably to a certain degree why a lot of kids end up on the spectrum in the first place. And regardless of what their exposure may have been that was the catalyst, their inability to detoxify properly was probably part of that factor. So in conjunction, while we're doing immunotherapy, while we're doing other therapies to control their allergies, certainly as you detoxify the body, you're giving your cells a better opportunity to function the way they should. So you've got a slew of different types of therapies and products that help with detoxification, and it really is just a function of finding what your child tolerates. I have a lot of kids that do homotoxicology, and they do really well on it. And some kids detoxify so quickly that they just have, bad reactions. Other kids do really well when mom jumps in the sauna with them, and they do infrared sauna. I have other kids, if they can tolerate it, do great with colon hydrotherapy. So, we've got a lot of tools at our disposal. It's really just what's available in your area, what you and your practitioner agree is a good course of action. But ultimately, I think, having some plan to help improve detox pathways, again, it can only help.
And now what about the relationship between allergies and autoimmunity? I know we talked a little bit about their immune system, but is this something our children are, some children maybe, I don't know, but is it something you see more often that they're born with a weakened immune system? Or is it something that an environmental trigger, or is it a combination? And how do those two kind of relate together?
Yeah, well, I think it's a combination of the two. I think, certainly there's a genetic disposition. And of course, we've got so much information coming out now about genetic SNPs and the 23andMe data about how well your body can get rid of various chemicals and certainly toxins. But, in addition to that, that pathway that drives allergy is the same pathway that drives autoimmunity. And, the fact that we're seeing this massive increase in autoimmunity kind of parallels the increase we're seeing in allergy, which parallels the increase in autism and so forth. So at the end of the day, I think that level of immune dysfunction that's happening is really tweaking the immune system in a way that it gets shifted away from doing what it's supposed to do. And without making everybody an immunologist out there, we've got these cells called T helper cells. And the T helper cells are really the conductors of the immune system. And there are T helper 1 cells and T helper 2 cells. And Th1 cells are really the cells that directly go after the microbe that's a problem, or the thing that doesn't belong. So if it sees a virus or a bacteria, it just munches it and gets rid of it, and that's kind of the end of that. It doesn't need another a mechanism to do its job. The Th2 cells, though, are really involved more in antibody production. So they by themselves don't really get rid of, these things that are foreign. So whether it's, again, a virus or bacteria, it basically just sends an alert to another part of the immune system saying, hey, over here, there's a problem, we need to deal with it. And when you start activating that Th2 mechanism, or I should say overacting it, that's what starts driving allergy, that's what starts driving autoimmunity, and that's often why we see the two go hand in hand. So we think of this balance between Th1 and Th2 kind of being like a seesaw where one goes up, the other goes down. It's unfortunately far more complex than that, but for practical purposes, that's kind of an easy way to think of it. And ultimately, I think a lot of kids on the spectrum are really Th2 dominant. That seesaw is tilted too far the other direction. So ultimately, we're trying to find ways to down-regulate that Th2 response, get things more back in balance. And again, many of the kids I work with, will hear that because they get sick easily. They pick up every cold and flu that comes along the way. That normal mechanism that should help get rid of a virus or bacteria just doesn't work the way it's supposed to, because when Th2 is dominant, it actually sends a signal to Th1 which suppresses it. So in some weird way, your immune system's accidentally suppressing that part of your immune system that you really need to function well. So again, we're just trying to, re-establish that norm and get balance in that Th1, Th2 system.
It's interesting because, we talk about autoimmunity and children, being more prone to getting sick and everything else. And yet I feel like we still live in a world where people aren't looking at autism as, a child that is sick in certain ways, like they have autoimmune issues. Often the general public is still looking at autism as though it's a neurological issue, but they're not looking at why it's a neurological issue. It's like other, I feel like any other diagnosis out there that have children that aren't feeling good. I mean, we have kids that are epileptic. We have children that are allergic to so many different things. We have children with celiac. We have children that with pandas and PANS, and the list goes on and on. And yet I still am amazed that it's not on the 5 o'clock news, Well, they're not saying, well, wait a second, this autism, it's growing at a rate, but why are all these kids sick? And why is there no, clinics for these children to be able to go in and have doctors like yourself to say, all right, this is your treatment, this is your treatment, this is your treatment, and you have all these specialists, and I often joke about this, but I mean it sincerely. It's not like an episode of Grey's Anatomy where, like, by the end, the person's like, here's your treatment, everything's good. I mean, in one of those episodes, in less than an hour, they've diagnosed them with brain cancer and cured them, and they've all lived happily ever after. And yet, here we are still in 2018, and people in the general public don't understand that our kids are actually often quite sick in some capacity, and I don't understand that. Why is that, as a doctor's perspective?
Well, what happened is that autism fell under the auspice of psychiatric illness. Mm-hmm. It's in the DSM-5. So, because it's always been thought of as really kind of a psychiatric mental issue, people forget that it is a very complex medical issue. Like you said, these kids, most of them have legitimate medical problems. If you took the autism diagnosis away and just had everything left, and they walked into the pediatrician their jaw would be on the floor with just all the health issues that these kids are dealing with. Mm-hmm. But I think, the fact that we've kind of shoved it under this umbrella, send them off to the pediatric neurologist, let them get their diagnosis. And of course, from a conventional standpoint, there's no drug to treat autism. Mm-hmm. They think they can just fix it all with ABA and a little bit of, OT or speech therapy. And I guess I've always been amazed too that many pediatricians who are supposed to be the experts in this are really kind of ignorant to the fact that there's so many medical issues that need to be addressed. And I think for those of us that work in this field, we're constantly addressing the onslaught of medical issues that haven't been addressed, from the GI issues to the seizures to the sleep disturbances, to the eczema and asthma and everything else that these kids are dealing with. And again, when you start fixing these medical problems, their autism gets better. Because ultimately you're correcting underlying physiology that's not functioning well. So in our world, this is really kind of a basic thing. Again, I don't know why it hasn't caught on to the rest of the medical community. It's a little dumbfounding to me, the fact that we've now seen autism increase, really maybe we'll say over the last 30 years in particular, that it hasn't become more mainstream, that you just need to start dealing with all these environmental and physical issues. I was writing an article last night about different supplements to use for autism, and I was doing a lot of research, and I had to laugh because I was I want to see what's actually been published on gluten casein free diet, because so many families, this is like their starting point. And I literally laughed out loud. I came across an article that was just published March of this year in a reputable journal, and there is no evidence that gluten casein-free diet helps children with autism. And then if you actually read the article, they go on to report how there was a percentage of kids, and I forget what the percentage was, that had better language and better cognition. They were most social. So their synopsis was that it doesn't help every child with autism. Well, duh.
Yeah, nothing better.
Exactly. But it was interesting that the conclusion they came in is that we cannot recommend following this diet if you have a child with autism, because not every child with autism that we tested, had a positive response. But they acknowledged in the paper that a percentage of kids, and it was a decent percentage, did. So why not be truthful and say there are some kids who will benefit from this diet, there were some who won't. But you know what? It's free. Anybody can do it. And why not start there? That would have been a more honest assessment.
Yeah, so, and you don't wait at a doctor's office to get a prescription to go do a gluten-free, dairy-free diet. And the thing, even with cancer, when you think about cancer, some treatments work really well for cancer patients, and then some don't. And it's like I look at our community as we have subgroups, and so we don't know why this works for this or that works for that. I think eventually we'll figure that out more, just like the cancer world has. And I really look at autism as an autoimmune issue. I almost wish they would take the label away and not even call it autism, and just call it like an autoimmune distress disorder or something, right?
Yeah.
Because we have all these kids that have all these things overlapping. And I think, and I'm just a mom that, lives this every day, who am I? Right? But I really feel that, a lot of these neurological issues are coming because you have a food allergy, or coming because they have high toxicity of some metals, or maybe the environment, maybe the air, or whatever it is. And the thing is, until we can come together, as the mainstream and say, hey, something doesn't smell right here. Like, this seems very odd to me. Like, and I guess it has to happen to the person, whoever the person, I'm keep waiting for whoever this magic person's going to be, that it has to happen. Because it's approximately in 1 in 20 households in America has a family member with autism. So I don't know when, we always say this in the community, like, when is enough enough? Like, when are we going to be able to figure out that these kids are sick and we need help? And so I'm so grateful for doctors like yourself, because there's really not that many of you guys. There really isn't. Like, I've been in this community 14 years, and I'm thinking if I just take a guesstimate, there's probably somewhere between 20, maybe 30 that are kind of out there really living this life, trying to help. And that's think about that. 1 in 20 households in America have a family member with autism. And in the US, this is what we have. So I'm grateful, but at the same time, I feel like we need more and more of you, because even like today, you're running late because there's only so much on your plate. Like, your list is just so overgrown. And I mean, what are we going to do? Now, one of my last questions to you. I get so passionate. I'm like, what is wrong with these people? Like, how come they can't figure this out? When we're talking about allergies, can they ever, I hate to use the word cured, but for lack of a better word, can they ever be cured? Can they ever be gone away forever? And can they never come back up after we kind of fix them?
And the answer is maybe.
Okay.
Well, I think for the people who have legitimate anaphylactic allergies, those are hard. But I have had patients, with certain therapies that either their allergies are much better, or before it could have killed them, now they get an itchy throat. It's inconvenient, but it's not life-threatening. I've had other people that every time they would eat a certain food, they would get hives, they would get eczema, they would get asthma, that now can eat the food and they get no reactions at all. So the overwhelming majority of people, when they kind of get on a program to desensitize themselves, will get, a positive benefit and get to a point where they're able to eat foods that they weren't previously able to eat. The intolerances are a little bit different because they often are genetic. You're usually born with lactose intolerance or gluten intolerance. I can't change what Mother Nature didn't give you. Mm-hmm. And so in those cases, it really does become a function of dietary management. But for more, again, these delayed sensitivities, certainly there are ways of circumventing that and getting to a point, where your child can eat the foods and not have a reaction, or go out on a high pollen count day without coming in looking like an allergic mess. And, it doesn't happen quickly. It can be months to years of treatment. My feeling is the earlier we can start, the better off. I mean, the youngest child I've ever treated was 2 days old. I had a child that was born with head to toe eczema. And, as the child started, breastfeeding, the eczema was getting worse. This was a rare case where we actually had to get the baby off of mom's milk because she was eating too many things that the child was reacting to. But the earlier you start, while the immune system's developing in those early stages of life, that's a great time to intervene and start helping manipulate the immune system. So again, that you become more immune tolerant. But really, for people at any age, it may take a little longer, but it's always possible. And, every time I say that, I get a little pushback sometimes that, there are some people who don't respond. Yes, that's true with every therapy. There are some people who don't respond. But again, in my practice, I would argue maybe 90% of the people really do benefit when we start doing these type of therapies. So again, it's the overwhelming majority. And it's just a function of, find a practitioner who, understands these kind of therapies and is willing to work with you. And I think, you'll start to see some really positive changes in a pretty short period of time.
Well, I have so enjoyed talking with you, and I know that everybody watching, we learned so much, and I think that's the thing. We have to keep learning. We have to keep growing. We have to keep asking the questions for these doctors to keep finding the answers out for us. Now, if you're watching, you're thinking, gosh, how come my significant other isn't watching right now? Or, gosh, I really wish that my aunt or my uncle would have watched this with me, or my mom or dad, so that they could help me understand this even better. Here's the cool thing. All you have to do is go to summit.com. That's autismhopesummit.com. And you can buy the whole package. And Dr. Ingels can be in your living room every day. And you can watch it over and over again. And here's the coolest part. Every time you buy the Autism Hope Summit package, the dollars raised go back to the Autism Hope Alliance, which goes back into our nutritional scholarship fund so we can help more and more families. So I love it. Somebody earlier today said it's not, I said it's a win-win. They said, no, it's a no-lose. So absolutely, it's a no-lose, and I love it. So, you know, I love talking with doctors like yourself. Like I said, I learn so much, and I thought I knew a lot about allergies prior to this call. So I love doing this summit. I feel like I get like the pre-summit compared to everybody else. You're giving something away to all of our families, and I'm just so grateful. I'm super excited for you guys. Okay, Dr. Ingels is giving free ebooks on his top 10 immune boosting recipes. We all love free stuff. You know, Oprah gave cars away, but guess what we give? We give ebooks, and we give lots of other cool stuff. So he's giving a free ebook on the top 10 immune boosting recipes, and that's just awesome. So you guys will be able to find the links here in the video. And before we leave, Dr. Ingels, what message do you want to leave families that are maybe just starting out, maybe they just got the diagnosis, or a family that's been on this journey for quite some time?
Yeah. Well, before I answer that, I want to come back to something you said earlier, because you know what? I'm just a mom. You know what? You've got to give yourself a lot more credit than that. All of you parents out there who are just moms and just dads, you guys are doing more work than most doctors are doing. And I'm always so privileged to work with families like you, because you guys do so much research. You teach us half the time. You know, we're busy in our practices. Sometimes it's really hard to do all this research. And you guys walk in with 1,000 papers. Hey, did you see this? And we're like, no, we didn't, but thank you for sharing it. So like I said, you know, it really is a collaboration between us and you. You know, it's a team effort, and it takes it, because there's just so much stuff we're trying to plow through to help these kids get better and recover. So on the heels of that, you know, my best advice, whether you're new to this or you've been in the game for a while, is, you know, find a practitioner that you really resonate with. It's so hard to manage all this on your own. And again, you do a lot of research, you become very well educated, you connect with all these other great families that are doing awesome work with their kids, and that's great. But there's so many other things that it's just kind of hard to know. And, you know, like I said, there's not a lot of us out there, but that we are out there. And find us, you know, help, you know, get connected with someone that you really resonate with, that's on the same page with you, that's really a champion for your son or daughter, because that's what's going to give you the best opportunity to get to recovery. It's so hard to do it on your own. You know, build that team around you. And, you know, even if there's a financial limitation, you know, I know most of us out there, you know, we all work on sliding scales, and we want to help your kids. So, you know, call us, you know, most people are willing to work with you. So just reach out and, you know, find that person or persons that's really going to complete your team. And I said, it's just going to give your child the best chance of recovery.
I love that message, because at the end of the day, it's hope. And this whole summit's about hope with a plan. We're giving you the tools, we're giving you the tips, and giving you a lot of the resources of where to start. So all of you guys watching, thank you for taking the time. And until next time, bye guys.